Morning, Glory America. Bonjour, hi, candidate Hugh Hewitt live inside the Beltway as the catastrophe in Kabul continues to unfold in real time. I am joined live by Senator Tom Cotton. Good morning, Senator. Thank you for joining me.
Good morning, Hugh. It's good to be on with you.
Axios is reporting this morning that two Biden officials spoke with Axios on the condition of anonymity, saying, quote, "There was no plan to evacuate our diplomats to the airport." A senior national security advisor told Axios about the preparations they inherited from the Trump administration. None of this was on the shelf, so to speak. When we got in on January 20th, we saw that the cupboard was bare. Your comment, Senator.
Just huge, preposterous blame shifting from a president who gave a speech yesterday that was dangerously detached from reality. He said the buck stopped with him, Hugh, and he spent that entire speech trying to pass the buck to the Trump administration, as it sounds like these administration officials are doing on background now, or to the Afghan political leadership or the Afghan military or even the Afghan civilians who are being targeted by the Taliban now. The Biden administration has complained about a lot of Trump policies that didn't prevent them from changing almost every Trump policy that they adopted, such as the Remain in Mexico policy at the border. Yet somehow this is the one policy, the Afghan policy, in which their hands were tied and they could do nothing. When in reality, Hugh, what you're seeing is the chickens coming home to roost for Joe Biden. As Bob Gates said 10 years ago, Joe Biden has been wrong about nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue for the last 4 decades.
May I interrupt you? Because 18 months ago, Secretary Gates was on this show where he said he stood by that statement, and he added this, cut number 32. What you have said that from your memoir that was the most controversial thing is that Vice President Biden, former Vice President Biden, hadn't been right on any major foreign policy issue in 40 years. Do you worry about a Biden administration and that fundamental inability to grasp great power competition infecting that West Wing?
Yeah, I stand by that statement. I will say, Hugh, it related mainly to things that had happened in the Cold War. Biden voted against every single arms program, I think, that Ronald Reagan put up on the Hill. He voted for the Iraq War and so on. So I do have those policy differences with him. I will say in the Obama administration, we did have a very deep disagreement on Afghanistan, and that was a big deal. But on issues like intervening in Libya and dumping Mubarak in Egypt, he and I actually were on the same side on those issues. So, and the other thing I write about in the book that hasn't gotten much attention is that I also think that the vice president had some issues with the military, and I wrote in Duty about how he would warn the president that he was being boxed in, that the military was trying to take away his options and so on, and he'd kind of rail at the generals, and that bothered me some. So, there are puts and takes with any presidential candidate. He brings a decency and an integrity and so on to the race, but I did have these issues with him.
Senator Cotton, the integrity and decency was wholly absent yesterday, but the railing at the generals may have led up to this. Have you heard the same reports I have, that he rejected all military advice on preparation for this?
Yes, of course, everyone in Washington knows that. Joe Biden even acknowledged as much earlier this year. But what you're seeing are those chickens coming home to roost. Add another decade to Bob Gates' observation. It's been 5 decades of disastrous foreign policy and national security judgment by Joe Biden. The difference is, for the first 50 years, it didn't really matter because he was a senator and a vice president. He was not in charge. He is now the commander-in-chief. And on the first major foreign policy crisis he has faced, you see the disastrous consequences of his terrible judgment. Joe Biden for the last 5 or 6 days has been essentially holed up in Camp David, I think shell-shocked at how terrible his judgment has proven in the real world. He came to Washington for a couple hours yesterday to give a speech in which, again, he blamed everyone but himself and then retreated back to Camp David once again.
Are we in 25th Amendment area?
Well, given what the alternative is with Kamala Harris, I'm not so sure about that. But we are in an area in which America is now dangerously exposed. So much of our security depends on the credibility and the resolve of the president in particular. And in the same way that when Barack Obama erased his red line in Syria, it had cascading effects all around the world in places like Crimea in Europe or the South China Sea in East Asia, as Russia and China saw how weak Barack Obama was. The world can now see that Joe Biden is impotent and incompetent, and we should not be surprised that you see Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and other adversaries of America already using this to their advantage. And I got to tell you, if I was sitting tonight in Taiwan or in eastern Ukraine or maybe even places like Israel, I would be very worried about America's resolve.
You used the term shell-shocked, and you're a combat veteran, so my ears picked up. Yesterday, Jim Garrity, I think, legitimately asked, is there something wrong with the president because he'd been missing, MIA, for 48, 72 hours. Do you have the concern over his capacity to absorb and react appropriately to information?
After that speech, I do, Hugh. I mean, again, that was a dangerous detachment from reality, totally oblivious to the conditions on the ground that he alone had created. He repeatedly overruled the best military advice of his commanders. This was not about Hugh just with the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, a question on which reasonable people disagree, but how that decision was executed. It was Joe Biden, I assure you, who insisted that all troops be gone by September 11th. Hugh, that is a politically symbolic date, but a tactically dangerous date. That is still at the height of the fighting season in Afghanistan. He said he was tied by the former administration's agreement with the Taliban. The date that agreement had said is May 1, so he'd already blown through that date. There was no reason other than Joe Biden wanting to beat his chest and crow on September 11th about getting American troops out of Afghanistan to choose that date. And now look at the political symbolism. Rather than celebrating all of our troops being out of Afghanistan on September 11th, the flag of the Taliban will be flying over our former embassy on September 11th.
Now, Senator, I want to go back to the Axios report. It says that the Biden officials, and very senior, I have my guesses, Trump effectively didn't have a plan to bring home all Americans, including troops, contractors, and diplomats, safely. One said that created, quote, headwinds and, quote, unnecessarily increased, close quote, the degree of difficulty for the new administration. Quote, the entire policy process had atrophied, one of the officials said. Quote, it was really manifest here. On the other hand, they set a May deadline for the withdrawal, the official said. On the other hand, there was no intra-agency planning on how to execute a withdrawal. Your comment on that, and could you, if you had been elected president on January 20th, organize an exit that would not have led to catastrophic loss of life and the abandonment of allies and interpreters and women who ought to have been removed?
Hugh, not only could I have executed that plan, any Marine captain or mid-career Foreign Service officer could probably have executed that plan. Again, what's being conducted is called a non-combatant evacuation operation. The Marine Corps has very well-detailed plans for such operations. The State Department takes the lead. They have officials who are experienced in these things. It was Joe Biden's decision to choose a politically symbolic date to withdraw all of our troops from Afghanistan, almost all of our troops from Afghanistan, when we still had as many as 10,000 American citizens. I'm not even talking about the Afghans who helped us, Hugh, but American citizens with American passports behind Taliban lines. My office has heard from hundreds of them over the last 48 hours. We've helped some of them get out of their hiding places and get to the airport, but many are still stranded awaiting guidance. I mean, Hugh, I've heard from so many Arkansans who have no military experience, no law enforcement experience, no diplomatic experience, who cannot believe the situation in Afghanistan. Like, who in their right mind would have thought that we would withdraw our four-star commander, Scotty Miller, and close Bagram Air Base, the air base that we had total control over, while leaving behind thousands of civilians? It should be the exact opposite, Hugh. I mean, you should keep control of the air base and leave your troops in place until you get your civilians out. Even ordinary Americans who have no experience in such operations believe that was the case and are astonished to learn it wasn't. I've heard from so many of them over the last 48 hours.
I have more confidence in CNN's Jeff Zucker organizing this than anyone in the administration, because he's got correspondents around the world and he moves them around. Honestly, I'm dumbfounded at how we could have done this. Let me talk to you about the Trump policy. Every never-Trumper who ever lived is using this as an opportunity to say it would have been the same, because otherwise they're complicit for the election of Joe Biden and this fiasco, and therefore they're laying. It would have been the same. Would this have been the same if President Trump had been reelected?
You know, Hugh, you can't rerun history and predict what would have happened under those circumstances. Here's what I don't think President Trump, or for that matter, almost any other president with an ounce of common sense would have done, is proceeded with any kind of withdrawal while the Taliban was on the offensive, violating its commitments, and withdrawn American troops and especially American air support during the middle of the withdrawal. And remember, this is how we train the Afghan army to fight, Hugh, not fighting with our Air Force, but with their own, yet supported by American contractors. I'm not talking about, soldiers with their feet dangling out the side of the Black Hawk ready to launch an air assault operation. I'm talking about mechanics and other logisticians who are helping the Afghan Air Force support the Afghan troops. When Joe Biden insisted they withdraw, too, over the last few weeks, we totally pulled the rug out from underneath the Afghan National Army. So it's hard to rerun history and think about what would have been different under different leadership or different circumstances. But it's hard to imagine how anyone could have bungled this operation more so than Joe Biden has.
Well, I do believe that it was a conditions-based withdrawal. I have read the Doha agreement. Paragraph 4, I believe, says there will be a negotiated agreement. It does not. It is premised on there not being an attack on Kandahar and Kabul. In my view, I haven't read the annexes, and there are some secret annexes. But I know this, and Mark Thiessen has made this argument. More than 50,000 Afghan soldiers are KIA since 2015 fighting for their country. More than 2,800 are KIA since January of this year. I believe the last American casualty was in 2020. Is it fair for Joe Biden to shame the Afghan army from whom we pulled all support, according to the Wall Street Journal, months ago?
No, it's totally unfair to you. Again, despite its shortcomings, the Afghan army had been trained to fight very similar to our forces with close air support. And Joe Biden pulled the rug out from underneath them. He insisted that all of the technical and logistical support that American contractors were giving to them get out over the last month. Again, those were not American helicopters. They were not American service members. They were American contractors who were doing things like making sure their aircraft could continue to be fueled and fly. And if you train any army to fight in one way and you take away a critical part of that training, of course they are going to be hamstrung. And that's exactly what you've seen over the last month in Afghanistan. And it all goes back, once again, to Joe Biden's decision to choose a politically symbolic but tactically dangerous date to execute this withdrawal decision. You can disagree about the withdrawal decision, but Joe Biden has completely mishandled the execution of that withdrawal.
Senator Cotton, I have one last area of questions, and I'm a civilian, so I don't know, and I don't want to criticize the Pentagon. There has been no discussion except a brief statement that was posted on Twitter and then withdrawn about the rules of engagement for the Marines and the 101st Airborne, which is reported to be there, and you, of which you are an alumni. Are you confident that our troops have the authority to protect themselves and everyone at the airport, and will use that authority?
So, Hugh, from what I have heard from senior military leadership, as well as my contacts on the ground, that they do have that authority. American troops always have the inherent right of self-defense. I think the challenge they faced in the early hours, Sunday night and Monday morning, is that the people who were approaching the airport were not Taliban fighters. They were terrified civilians. So it was more about non-combatant crowd control than it was fighting off the Taliban. My understanding now is they have a secure perimeter at the airport, that flights are landing and taking off. However, they don't have much standoff. They don't have distance between the perimeter and civilians or combatants on the outside, as the case may be. So it is a dangerous and volatile situation, a situation that would not have happened if we still had control of Bagram Air Base, Hugh. Bagram Air Base sits in the middle of a wide open plain with hundreds, if not thousands, of yards of visual standoff. Kabul International Airport is right smack in the middle of Kabul. So, again, it's Joe Biden that has created this dangerous situation on the ground that puts at risk the lives of American troopers and civilians, as well as innocent Afghans.
Reporters for the British Telegraph have reported that the British government is worried about terrorist attacks by splinter groups. In other words, the Taliban ain't the only group of terrorists operating, giving the lie to the presidents. We've destroyed al-Qaeda. Have you heard those reports? Is the Pentagon prepared?
Yeah, so I'm very worried about the potential for terrorist attacks of all stripes, Hugh. I mean, I'm worried about a terrorist attack, through, say, a car bomb or suicide bomber on the perimeter of that airport. I'm worried that if there is some kind of slapdash, disorganized evacuation of Afghans without any vetting of who they are, that al-Qaeda or ISIS could slip operatives onto an American airplane. I'm worried about the crowing and the celebrating that you see from the Taliban and other terrorist groups. Nothing breeds more terrorism like the success of these radical Islamic groups. So I sadly think that you're going to see a large surge into Afghanistan of Islamist terrorists from around the world. You're going to see the safe havens that al-Qaeda had reconstituted in Afghanistan, which is the number one security interest we've always had for 20 years in Afghanistan, and what Joe Biden has never explained in 5 months how he was going to prevent. Yesterday, he was talking about over-the-horizon strike capability. Well, Hugh, if the over-the-horizon counter-terrorist strike capability is as proficient as this evacuation has been, I think we should be very worried about a terrorist safe haven in Afghanistan.
My last question, Senator Cotton. I salute the heroism of reporters, journalists, and humanitarians who are at work in Afghanistan. I am, however, concerned that pictures from Afghanistan, there is a criminal element. There is money to be made by nabbing Americans. You know that. O'Brien, the former national security, is your friend and my friend. He was the hostage negotiator. Is it responsible for any American to stay in Afghanistan right now, regardless of how important the news is and humanitarian efforts?
Yes, Hugh, I would urge any American to try to get out of the country. They should have been registered for the State Department's SMS alert system. They should be getting notified about when to report to the airport. Like I said, we've heard from hundreds of them who were unable to contact the State Department at the height of the chaos over the weekend. We've helped a few of them get to the airport already. We're still working with those. But any American in Afghanistan who has the ability to get out safely, I'd strongly advise them to do so. I know that's heartbreaking for many of them, whether they have local Afghan partners, friends, even Afghan family that are not eligible. But at this point, I think it's the safest for the Americans in Afghanistan. It's the best thing for the national security interest of our country for them to try to find a way to get safe passage.
I have one. I lied. One more question, Senator. Zawahiri, I expect to pop up on video if he's not dead. What do you think about him, and what is your estimate of Pakistan's complicity in this?
Well, Pakistan has long harbored the Taliban, whether they do that actively or they acquiesce to it. So they have some complicity in the strength that the Taliban has regathered in recent years. But, Hugh, they should be very careful because, as Churchill said, appeasement is often feeding the alligator, hoping that it will eat you last. The lines that of the Taliban support do not acknowledge the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. There's a lot of Taliban in western Pakistan. And, Hugh, if the gathering strength of the Taliban in Afghanistan leads to the gathering strength of their compatriots in Pakistan, and that destabilizes the Pakistani government, then you would have the true worst-case scenario in which a terrorist-supporting organization potentially could get access to Pakistan's nuclear weapons.
Senator Tom Cotton, thank you for your extra time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.